Hi, I'm John Taylor from Devoted Golfer TV, here with Rob Neal of BioDynamics. Rob, I wonder if you could start out by telling us how you got interested in biodynamics and a little bit about your background.
Sure, John. Thanks for inviting me to be here. So I started my career as an academic back in the early 80s. I just started playing golf. This was in 1982. And I decided that, all right, I'll do a three-dimensional golf swing analysis as part of my master's degree. I went on and did a PhD. It was on throwing, but still the same sort of theme, segment interactions, or how different parts of the body are organized in movement patterns in order to produce high speed at the distal end of a segment. So golf was a good application, throwing is a good application as well, because the objective in many of those activities and many others is to generate high speed at the end of the link. And so I completed my PhD, then taught as a university professor for 15 years, and then Karen and I decided that we would try to develop a business based around three-dimensional real-time motion capture, which had emerged over the last 5 years of my academic career. And so the electromagnetic tracking systems were available. I began writing my own software to create reports and to be able to analyze the data that we were getting from golfers. And for the first couple of years, it was really very much about trying to find out how you could use the information that was available through this technology to assist the golfer and the golf coach in providing a good outcome. So our first attempts were about trying to find out how we could get close to the golf coaches to help them understand the swing better and give them insights into things that they couldn't get from their eye or from video capture, which was available at the time.
So communication turned out to be a critical part of the equation.
And still is the most important part. So if you're trying to convince someone that they need to use 3D motion capture, then you need to make sure that they're educated sufficiently well in order to understand the information that's coming from it.
What are you measuring with your system?
So overall, we measure the 3D motion of the upper body, so pelvis through to the hands on both sides of the body and the club, and it's real-time 6-degree of freedom measurement. And what we spent a lot of time doing is developing what we call anatomical coordinate systems so that we can examine the motion at different joints as well as motion of the segments of the body. Joint motion is about how one segment moves relative to the other. So you could look at the arm relative to the upper torso or the head relative to the upper torso. Segment motion typically then is the movement of the head relative to some global reference frame. So your target line, vertical, and then a forward and backward direction.
Where do you place the sensors?
They're placed in such a way as to minimize movement on the body and to be least obstructive to the golfer. So one sits on the back of the hand, the other one just above the elbows, another one on the forehead, on the back, and then on one of our systems we have wires then that trail back to a processing unit, and so these wires all need to be trained in such a way that they don't restrict the golfer's movement. And while it looks from the outside as though it could be encumbering, it really doesn't influence your swing as well as we know. So people go, oh, I'm supposed to swing in this? And then after they've hit a few shots they go, yeah, it really doesn't influence me that much at all. It's like putting on a light jacket or a sweater before going out to play. That feels different, but does it really change the underlying movement? Probably not.
Not everyone thinks about 6 degrees of freedom in movement. I wonder if you would just briefly explain what that is.
It's actually a very important distinguishing feature between some of the, or amongst some of the competing technologies around.
Right.
So what is relatively easy to do with different types of technologies is measure the 3 rotations. So if you could imagine my hand here, I could rotate around my index finger, about my big finger, or about my thumb. So that would be 3 independent rotational axes of movement, so 3 degrees of freedom, right? The harder part is to measure the movement along the axes. So these are the translational degrees of freedom. So I could slide along the direction of my index finger, my middle finger, or my thumb. And so the combination of rotation and translation sum up to the 6 degrees of freedom. So 3 translational, 3 rotational degrees of freedom. And to properly describe the 3-dimensional movement of a rigid body, so a body segment, a golf club, your head, you need to measure those 6 parameters at every instant in time.
Isn't there also an external reference point that allows you to measure the translation?
Every measurement system needs some sort of global reference frame, and you need to have a set of axes then for 3-dimensional space. So if you're going to describe movement in these directions, then that's what your global reference frame is doing. And then you can have rotations around axes that are embedded in the segment or in the body, but the location of those rotations in space is given relative to your external coordinate system.
Right. So the measurements that you make, what do you find most interesting for the golf coaches? What do you think is the most important technology or message, information that they get from the system?
We can measure what you do in your short game, your putting, your long game, all using the technology. But that, again, is only one part of becoming a good golfer. And I think over the years, the emphasis has changed, not just measuring the rotations, but finding out where those rotations took place, and the movements in translation alongside the rotations. So for example, if you are looking at the pelvis motion during the backswing, we know that it's going to rotate, but where it rotates in space is important as well, because if you were to look from face on video and someone's pelvis rotated and swayed away to the side, you as a golf coach are going to say, no, that's not the ideal movement pattern there. And then you might look at another guy who says, all right, I'm going to rotate, but then they'll reverse pivot. So this is the translation in concert with the rotation. And then what really good golfers do is they rotate, and then just before they finish their rotation, they actually start translating toward the target to begin that movement sequence of proximal to distal movement that we know as the kinematic or the timing sequence in the golf swing.
There's been some discussion lately about whether the proximal to distal sequencing of the kinematic sequence really holds up for all golfers and all efficient swings. Is that something that you've come across?
It is very much dependent upon which components of velocity of the different segments that you look at, how you frame it in terms of the coordinate systems that you use, and importantly, how you go and interpret the information that you go there. So I think it's a good metric. It's not an absolute thing, though. But I'm not convinced by the arguments that say, oh, there's no such thing as a kinematic sequence or a timing sequence, because it's pretty evident in throwing activities, in kicking, and then in golf, that you do need to be able to generate energy using our big muscles and then transfer the energy out to the striking implement or the high moving part of the body, high speed part of the body. How that's done, I don't think anyone really knows, but we know that there are some strong underlying physiological properties of muscles that dictate if we're going to be good at getting high speed, we need to use our muscles in a way that allows them to contribute to that. And John, with your background, I'm sure you know the force-velocity relationship in muscle, which says simplistically, the faster the muscle shortens, the less force it can produce. So if we get a muscle contracting early and moving fast early, but it is spent by the time we want to hit the golf ball, then that's not a very good way of doing it. So what we probably need to do is use big muscles, get the whole system moving first. Once they've reached their maximum contraction speed and they can't really contribute much to the generation of energy, then we need to use that as a springboard for the next segment to make its contribution. So the notion of sequential activation of muscles during the downswing is, I think, a pretty strong concept, and I think it has good tenets in physiology as well as in biomechanics.
Considering that the upper body and lower body and arms are all interacting with each other in the swing, and that it's a rotational movement pattern, how do you see the segments influencing each other? I'm thinking about whether the upper body influences the lower body to decelerate at some point in the swing, or is it the other way around?
It's definitely a case where they interact, because whenever we model, and using Newtonian physics here, if we have one segment here and this one here, we have some sort of force coupling between the two, our muscles. When I pull on this segment, I'm also pulling on this segment.
Right.
So you need some anchor point. So if I push here, then it pushes back, right? So always there are equal and opposite forces and torques being applied between the segments. When we accelerate the upper body and begin and make it rotate rapidly, it pulls on the lower body in the opposite direction and would tend to slow it down or to decelerate it. So this pattern of acceleration, deceleration is part and parcel of the way the forces are being applied across the joints of the body. We think about this as a joint. It's a complicated joint, but the shoulder joint, the same sort of thing happens. When we pull with our arm to accelerate the arm, we pull against the movement of the upper body. So if I'm rotating my chest this way and I pull my arm in the same direction, it's going to slow the rotational speed of the upper body.
So your technology would be quite useful in helping golfers maximize their power.
Yes, I mean, that's one of the ways in which we think we help golf coaches improve the sequencing and therefore the energy efficiency of someone's golf swing. So just by moving the body at the same speed in the correct order, you can gain speed or gain energy in the system at the distal end point because you're transferring it more efficiently.
Do you find that there is one swing style that is more efficient than others, or is it quite variable between golfers?
There's quite a bit of variation amongst golfers, but there are some principles that I think you need to follow if you're going to develop someone into being a good golfer. I basically think about it this way. You need to have a backswing that's organized and allows the body to load the muscles prior to when they need to move in the downswing. I think we need a weight shift during the downswing. Some might argue that you don't, but it's pretty evident that there's a little bit of benefit to be gained in terms of power generation and energy generation by shifting weight. And then you need the right sequence of rotations to generate the high speed at the club head. And then you need to do things also to gain control of the club face. So there are ways in which you could swing and generate a lot of speed, but then you might lose control of the orientation of the implement that you're striking as a consequence. Now, in long driving, that might be a risk worth taking because the objective is just to get one ball out of 6 on the grid. But for golf, it's a very important constraint that we have we need to be able to find the ball after we've hit it so that we can play our next shot.
Well, Rob, it's been a pleasure to meet
My
you
pleasure.
and talk to you, and thank you so much for visiting us.
Thank you.